Today's goals are going to be, I can describe the global wind system. I can locate different climatic zones. So we're going to talk about wind and how that moves around the entire globe and how that affects the climate across the globe. First of all, what are the global wind patterns? You're going to write down what's in the highlighted sections. The equator receives the sun's direct rays. Those direct rays are received at a perpendicular angle. And that angle looks like this, or like this. That's perpendicular. So here, air is heated and it rises, leaving low pressure areas behind. That warm air from the equator begins to cool and sink, and most of that cooling air eventually will go back and move towards the equator. Here's the globe, and these are the different types of winds that are included in the global wind system. We have the trade winds, which are on both sides of the equator. They both move toward the west and toward the equator. So we have our northeast trade winds. They're coming from the north and the east. And then these are our southeast trade winds coming from the south and the east. Next we have our westerlies. The westerlies are named the westerlies because they move from the west. They originate from the west and they move toward the poles. We also have them in the southern hemisphere, again, coming from the west toward the poles. They have this curved formation because of, again, the Coriolis effect. Lastly, we have the polar easterlies, and those move away from the pole from the east. So from the east, away from the poles. That's your global wind system. Now if you notice in the northern hemisphere, you have these winds that are moving in a clockwise direction. In the southern hemisphere, they move in a counterclockwise direction. So they're moving in that counterclockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. I want to click here to learn more about the wind. What is wind? Wind is air in motion. It is produced by the uneven heating of Earth's surface of the sun. Two very important things for you to know. Since the Earth's surface is made of various land and water formation, it absorbs the sun's radiation unevenly. Two factors that are necessary to specify wind is speed and direction. What causes wind to blow? As the sun warms the Earth's surface, the atmosphere warms too. Some parts of the Earth receive direct rays from the sun, those perpendicular angles, all year, and some are warm all year. Other places receive indirect rays, so the climate is colder. Warm air, which weighs less than cold air, rises. Then cool air moves in and replaces that rising warm air. This movement is what makes the wind blow. Very important information. Again, we're talking about that unequal heating. And you have warm air, which weighs less than cold air. Okay? Now let's talk about the three types of global wind systems, the three types of wind. What are the trade winds? Trade winds are just air movements toward the equator. They appear to be curving to the west, whether they are traveling north or south, and they're curving to the west because of this Coriolis effect. So please add that to your notes. Next, we have something called the prevailing westerlies. These are the winds between the 30 and 60 degrees latitude. These are winds that move toward the poles and seem to curve toward the east because they're coming from the west. So let's take a look at these again. Let's kind of clear this up so you can see this a little better. Well, here are our westerlies coming from the west, going up and toward the poles. And these are the westerlies also, again, curving toward the pole, coming from the west. And this is at that between that 30 and 60 degrees. Same up here, between 30 and 60 degrees. Those are our westerlies. Lastly, we're going to talk about the polar easterlies. Those form when the atmosphere over the pole cools. As that air flows away from the poles, it is turned to the west by the Coriolis effect. These winds begin in the east, that's why we call them the easterlies. So let's plug these in. Now that you know between 0 and 30 degrees latitude, we have the trade winds to the south of the equator and to the north of the equator. The easterlies are at the poles, coming from the east. And the westerlies are between the 30 and 60 degree marks on both the north hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Let's talk a little bit now about climatic zones. We have polar, temperate, and tropical. When you think of the word polar, I'm sure you think of the word cold or cool or ice caps or polar bears. And so that's your first clue that we have polar climates at the poles. Next one I want to talk about is tropical. When you think of the word tropical, you might think of the word warm, or Florida, or Hawaii, or the Bahamas. So that should tell you that you should know that this is warm areas, and we know that the equator is a very warm spot on Earth. So that leaves us temperate, which means moderate temperatures are the average temperatures throughout the year. And that is the area between 30 and 60 degrees north and 30 and 60 degrees south. So we have temperate zones there and there. We in Michigan happen to live in temperate zones. So there's a final picture of our climatic zones. Again, temperate zone is between 30 and 60 degrees north latitude and south latitude.